This is Billy Kay celebrating the life of RB Cunninghame Graham, one of the most remarkable Scots of the 19th and 20th centuries. That most folk have never heard of him, SNP supporters attribute to the fact that Labour historians have played down his role in the founding of their party with Keir Hardie because of his subsequent role in the founding of the SNP. One place, however, that most educated people have heard of him is Argentina. John C. McIntyre, editor of the Cunninghame Graham collection, and Chris Dixon, head of languages at Dublin Institute of Technology.
There's a Cunninghame Graham High School in Buenos Aires. There isn't a Cunninghame Graham High School in Scotland, and I think that tells its own tale.
My daughter spent her gap here in San Miguel de Tucumán, and her teacher had gone to the Cunninghame Graham High School and gave her a present of El Escocés Errante.
There have been quite a number of good books, including one by a lady called Alicia Jurado. She praises him to the skies.
The former attaché of the Argentinian embassy in Dublin, I was speaking to her at a meeting, and she had never heard of him. So I was doing my best to share these ideas about him. And then 2 days later, she phoned me up to say that she went back to the embassy and like she was the only person in the cultural section that hadn't heard of him. And they were appalled at the idea that she had met some Scot that knew about Cunninghame Graham and that she didn't. And so her boss had said, you must phone him up and say, we do all know about him and we do all appreciate everything that he did.
And of course he died in Buenos Aires in 1936 on his last trip there. And he lay in state in the theatre there and was visited by the president. His body was lay in state before it was brought back to Scotland. So he was revered in South America and an international figure of some note.
Lachlan Munro, editor of An Eagle in a Hen House, selected political speeches and writings of R.B. Cunninghame Graham. And now, from the Archive series in 1999, Don Roberto, Laird of Gartmore, Gaucho of the Pampas.
Silence and solitude were equally the note of north and south, with the horizon bounded by what a man could see when sitting on his horse. Well did the ancient Quichuas name the plains the Pampas, the word signifying space, for all was spacious. Earth, sky, the waving continent of grass, the enormous herds of cattle and of horses, the strange effects of light, the fierce and blinding storms, and above all, the feeling in men's minds of freedom and of being face to face with nature under those southern skies.
A passage from Cunninghame Graham's evocative writing on the Pampas landscape of Uruguay and Argentina, which haunted his memory and his creativity all his life, giving him greater renown in South America than in his native Scotland. But what was a Harrow-educated aristocrat doing among those exotic cowboys and Indians in the lawless expanse of the Pampas in the 1870s? Family members Jean Polworth and Jamie Jauncey, and Don Roberto's biographers, Lawrence Davis and Cedric Watts.
Cunninghame Graham came from a family that was naturally adventurous. Ancestors had fought for the cause of Scottish independence. He was partly Spanish in background. He had many much-travelled ancestors, and I think he was trying to live up to that tradition. He was also a family with strong liberal traditions, which he was extending in his own way. And I think as a young lad, he was influenced by the reading he undertook, and some of that reading, e.g. the Adventures of Tom Bainbridge in a boys' magazine, was reading which would encourage one to visit outposts, to seek out the unfamiliar. After all, Joseph Conrad had left Poland and gone to sea and travelled the world before settling down as a writer. So I think there's a great deal of romanticism circulating in the 19th century, and some people responded to the call of romance. He did it.
Graham looked around as a young man, 17 or so, for ways of earning a living. He considered tea planting in Ceylon. He tried to get a job as a king's messenger. He considered going to Russia. He ended up going to Argentina, in the hope of recouping the family fortunes.
Because the family weren't at all well off. And he went on an emigrant ship, and it was pretty awful, I think, and he was a very bad sailor, so he was terribly seasick. And it was a long journey in those days. But once he got there, he got to the Ogilvy's estancia, and he found that they'd all taken to the bottle because there was nothing to do, so they all lay about dead drunk. The place was going to pot, and so a cattle dealer came along, and Robert said, "Can I join you and do a bit of travelling round?" And so off he went on his horse. There wasn't much point staying in the estancia at Gaucho.
And within a few days of leaving with them, he found himself being swept up by a passing revolutionary army, a conscript into this army. So life was pretty exciting for him, I think, from the start.
And they refused to believe he was a foreigner because he spoke fluent Spanish. They couldn't understand the long name of Robert Bontin Cunninghame Graham, and they simply rechristened him Roberto Botin, and decided that he was really a Gallego, a Galician, who was pretending to be a foreigner. Well, at first I don't suppose he was terribly pleased at first, but he quickly settled into their carefree existence. One of the good things about the revolutionary force was that it didn't really fight very many battles.
Ian Stewart of St Andrews University on Don Roberto's first revolutionary period. Conservative political opponents later in his life would ask him where he was going to set up his guillotine, so radical were his policies. They were joking, mostly. But had they known of Don Roberto's youthful adventures, they may have had some cause for concern. His Gaucho army didn't fight many battles, but he recalled that, given the opportunity, they enjoyed putting their working skills into practice.
For months, the revolution had been going on. The rival bands roaming about and stealing horses, slaughtering the cattle, and now and then, if they could catch a man or two alone, cutting their throats just as they cut a sheep's, driving the knife in at the point with the edge outwards and bending back the head.
During the wars, what they did was play the violin with somebody because of that movement from left to right. It meant actually cutting their throats. Ammunition was expensive, so what they did is cut the throats. And that was a very clean way of killing people.
And he didn't know which side he was on. He didn't know whether he was fighting for the whites or the reds. But being a boy of 18, he thought the whole thing was absolutely glorious adventure. And they certainly had some extremely exciting skirmishes. But when the revolution was over, of course, he was free to go back to the estancia.
No doubt to catch his breath. Nothing could have been further from the strictures and formalities of upper-class society in Victorian Britain than Robert's experience on the plains. For 7 crucial years, his main companions were horses and their riders, the legendary gauchos. Gustavo San Roman is Uruguayan and teaches, among other things, gaucho literature at St Andrews University.
A gaucho was really a kind of punk of the conquest. They were the Spaniards that left their peers to go and live with the Indians. And from the Indians, they learned some of the skills. And one of the most famous one is the bolas. And I have some bolas here, which of course can't be seen. But this is a thong of leather that has been twisted and it has 3 ends. And each end has a stone, which is itself covered in leather. And what you do with these rather deadly stones, you throw it, circle it up in the air and throw it at passing horses or cattle or...
People.
People as well.
And ostriches.
Ostriches is what I was thinking of, yes. So this is an Indian tool that they picked up.
Nothing could be more typical of the wildlife of 40 years ago upon the plains than was the figure of a gaucho dressed in his poncho and his chiripa, his naked toes clutching the stirrups, his long iron spurs kept in position by a thong of hide dangling below his heels, his hair bound back by a red silk handkerchief, his eyes ablaze, his silver knife passed through his sash and tirador, and sticking out just under his right elbow, his pingo, with its mane cut into castles, and its long tail floating out on the breeze as twisting Las Tres Marias round his head, he flew like lightning down a slope, which the mere European horseman would have looked on as certain death, intent to bore one of a band of fleet Neandus all sailing down the wind. Letting the bolas go so easily it seemed as if his will and not his hand directed them. They hurtled through the air, revolving on their own axis 60 or 70 yards, and when the Saugus met the ostrich's neck, the centrifugal force being averted, the balls fell down, and wrapping tightly round the legs, soon threw the giant bird upon its side.
The future Liberal MP and founding father of the Labour Party and SNP on how to bag an ostrich on the Pampas. The appeal of the gaucho lay in their freedom. They would occasionally linger to do a stretch of paid work on a ranch, but that didn't last long, and bands of them would light out for the frontier, living off the wild cattle they lassoed on the vast grassland. Simply put, Cunninghame Graham dropped out and became a gaucho, absorbing their culture and storing up rich memories to be retold by the writer of later years.
And so the typical scenery would be the gauchos squatting or sitting on a skull of a cow, and they sit there around a fire, eating the meat that is being roasted on the fire and drinking mate olivos, and always telling a story. There's always stories that go around.
Well, in those photos, he wears the typical baggy trousers of the gaucho, the bombachas, as well as the large, wide belt, the tirador, which the gaucho would decorate with money. Coins were very often attached to the belt. A wealthy gaucho would have elaborate silver-handled daggers dangling from his belt. Cunninghame Graham also, in the gaucho pictures, were wearing the wide-brimmed hat, the long leather boots favoured by the gaucho.
He looks the part as a gaucho.
Yes, he does, with his long flowing hair and his full beard. Yes, he does indeed.
He's one of them. He's very happy to be one of them. And that also links to his appreciation of them. I mean, he's not a patronising European or a clumsy European. He's so respectful and learnt the trade. He wanted to be with them and be respected by them.
One of the key tests for acceptance in gaucho society was your horsemanship, and Cunninghame Graham was an excellent horseman. If you could ride a horse like a gaucho, and more importantly even than ride it, fall from a horse like a gaucho, that was the true test. If you could fall from a horse and land on your feet, you would be accepted in gaucho society.
His great iron spurs hung off his heels, and all his silver gear, the reins, the pasadores of the stirrups, the chapeo and fiador, and the great spurs themselves, jingled and clinked as he tore on to head the living maelstrom of the stampeding beasts. Suddenly, his horse, although sure-footed, keen and practised at the work, stepped in a hole and turned a somersault. He fell, just as a stone from the nippers of a crane, and his wild rider, opening his legs, lit on his feet so truly that his great iron spurs clanked on the ground like fetters as he stood holding the halter in his hand. As his horse bounded to his feet, his rider, throwing down his head and tucking his left elbow well into his side, sprang at a bound upon his back and galloped on.
A passage from El Rodeo. If you couldn't fall like a gaucho, you would be crushed under the horse, or even more frightening, left horseless, hundreds of leagues from a settlement, and at the mercy of Indians and others who played the violin. Although life in the plains was somewhat removed from his boyhood experience at Finlaston, Ardagh and Gartmore, the family estates by the Clyde and the Lake of Menteith, the people themselves had connections.
A lot of the gauchos were originally from Scotland. You know, there was Maldonaldo, who of course had been MacDonald, and a lot of them had Scottish names. And in fact, when I went during his 50th anniversary of his death, celebrations in Buenos Aires in 1986, we had a wonderful sort of memorial service in St. Andrew's Church, and there was a pipe band, and they played Amazing Grace. And when I went to talk to them at the end, none of them spoke any English. They were all Argentines.
I remember once coming long years ago to an outlying settlement in the province of Buenos Aires, where all the people came, I think, from Inverness-shire, but anyhow, once upon a time they had been Scotch. Their names were Highland, but were pronounced by those who bore them after the Spanish way, as Cameron and McIntyre, Maclean, Ferguson, and others which they had altered in the cant of their speech, so as to be unrecognisable except to those who spoke the language and knew the names under their proper forms. None of these Scoto-Argentines spoke English, although some knew a few words of Gaelic, which I imagine they pronounced as badly as their names.
But these days they've forgotten their English, their Gaelic, and they even look local. The quote goes, "They were all dark, tall, sinewy men, riders before the Lord, and celebrated in the district where they lived as being muy gaucho, that is, adroit with bolas and lasso."
A passage from the story San Andres. Scottish exiles frequent all the far-flung locations Graham reaches. In his West African story, A Convert, it's the dour, Bible-carrying missionary zealot, the Reverend Archibald MacRae, who said he aye liked oxtering about the word of God. In Buenos Aires, it's Christy Christison, a respectable merchant who's lost nane of his buchan dialect after 30 years in the River Plate. When offered the pick of Indian girls and horses in exchange for his wife, he's tempted, but tells the chief, "Nah, Christians dinna sell their wives, but they buy them." Later, we discover that Christie had bought his wife Jean back for the Peterhead brothel she had escaped to when he had battered her earlier in their marriage. San Andres is a gentler tale of love.
These Scots have now become gauchos, but they have kept some of their traditions and their values, kind of the good traditions that close the story, because the story is about a Scottish gaucho couple that love each other very much, and one of them dies, and the widower is so inconsolable, cries too much in the eyes of the father-in-law, and the father-in-law tells him, "My ancestors in the Highlands said, if you cry too much, the people who have died are going to be unhappy where they are and are going to have to come back. So don't cry too much."
The sheep were folded, and in the dark leaves of the old ombu, beside the door, the fireflies glistened, and from the pampa rose the acrid smell that the first freshness of the evening draws from the heated ground. Coming out of the rancho, Anacleto looked across the plain. His eyes were full of tears, but with a gulp he choked them, and muttering to himself, "No, it would be cowardly to break her rest. Don Alejandro says so. He had it from his father, who spoke Gaelico." He slowly lit a cigarette, and in the last rays of the light, watched the smoke curl up in the air, blue and impalpable.
The ending of San Andres. All of these stories were written at least 20 years later, but they're all based on real people and actual events, allowing for artistic license, of course. During his actual time in South America, all his energies were devoted to the art of survival.
Later on, he tried to establish a ranch on the southern frontier of Buenos Aires province in partnership with George Mansell. And that really was a pipe dream at that time because of the problems with Indian invasions. And within a few months of setting up that enterprise, he abandoned it and made his way back to Buenos Aires. Although en route, he was in fact captured by the Indians, along with another young Argentine Scot by the name of Juan MacLean. The two of them actually had escaped from the Indians, killing a guard, and were pursued across the country to Mar del Plata.
Then he went to Paraguay, which was a total shambles. Paraguay had been at war simultaneously with Uruguay, Brazil, and Argentina, the War of the Triple Alliance, and the place was devastated. He wrote, in his early years as a writer, a number of descriptions of that, and then, very near the end of his life, he wrote a biography of Solano Lopez, the dictator of Paraguay, very conscious in the early 1930s that he was describing dictatorship in a world where dictators were very much on the landscape. So he's describing the world of the 1860s and 70s in the world of Hitler and Mussolini.
One period, Cunninghame Graham actually decided to venture to Paraguay with the aim of establishing a yerba mate growing concern. Yerba mate, of course, being the dried leaf of a shrub related to the holly, which is brewed into the distinctive green tea of that region of South America. So off he went up into Paraguay where conditions were suitable. But unfortunately, he had insufficient capital to pursue the venture. But he was enchanted by the Paraguayan landscape, by its people.
The snakes, the hummingbirds, the alligators basking in the creeks, the whir of insects, and the metallic croaking of the frogs. The air of being in the grip of an all-powerful vegetation reduced a man travelling alone through the green solitude to nothingness. One felt as if In all that wealth of vegetation and strange birds and beasts, one's horse was the one living thing that was of the same nature as oneself.
The women were different too. Due to the wars, they outnumbered men 13 to 1. Needs must, and they were of a predatory disposition. A French traveller looks back in Graham's story, La Alcaldesa.
Les femmes, yes, but they were a danger we used to fly from then. And even Anisetto's cattlemen after the first trip would never willingly sleep in an Indian village. C'était trop terrible. I stood it pretty well. The French, you know, were never backward in such matters, and one has amour propre. But the odds were too great. Don Anisetto's capataz, a Correntino, a huge, great fellow, tried it and failed. We left him in Asuncion, in hospital. All the peonies would begin, and then after a trip or two, get shy and sleep out in the woods or on the plains beside their horses rather than face the Indian women in their towns. When I first heard about it, I thought it was a joke. But one experience did me for my life.
I'm quite sure the situation had certain attractions for a teenage boy, however, though I doubt the details would have gone down well with his doting mother and aunties back home. What would Aunt Helen have thought?
He writes another story called Aunt Eleanor, which was about his Aunt Helen's bears, and she was the horsiest of the lot. She lived in Leamington Spa and kept horses, and Uncle Robert used to ride with her, and she taught him how to ride as a little boy, or how she thought he ought to ride properly. And I think that developed into this marvellous ability of his to handle any horse. And there are endless stories about how he could ride any horse. And of course, everybody probably knows the story about Pampas, his horse that was rescued from the trams in Glasgow. An Argentine consignment of horses was sent over for the horse trams in Glasgow. And Uncle Robert happened to pass the depot where they were harnessing the horses, and one of them was playing up, and they were obviously never going to get him to get into the harness. Uncle Robert went up and sort of put a hand on his neck and calmed him down, and realised this horse was terrified, and said, "He's never going to pull a tram, that horse. Can I buy him off you?" And they more or less said, "Oh yes, we want to be rid of him. He's going to be no good to us." Uncle Robert paid £5 for him or something, took him back to Gartmore, and he became his favourite horse. And any picture of Uncle Robert on a horse, he's on Pampas.
Love of horses and of South America sustained him, so it's ironic that the other major journey he made on the continent was during the First World War, when he went as an agent of the government to procure horses for the horror of the Western Front. Taking away their freedom grieved him sorely. The social injustices he witnessed in South America undoubtedly influenced his later championing of the underdog in his political career. That direction could have been affected too by the sight of his countrymen getting on. The Stuarts, with whom he stayed in Paraguay, for example, were politically active in the region.
And at one time, there were Stuarts involved in the very highest level of politics in Paraguay, right up to, at one time, I think, in fact, a president called Stuart in the 19th century.
In the middle of the 19th century, there was briefly a man who was effectively the president of Uruguay, who was a Scot, Duncan Stuart.
Graham's wanderings also took him to Colombia and Brazil, where he wrote his book A Brazilian Mystic, while the desolate Jesuit ruins in Paraguay inspired him to write about Spanish brutality against the Indians in A Vanished Arcadia, which in turn gave rise to the wonderful feature film The Mission. But without doubt, his greatest South American legacy came from the Gaucho. You feel he was never sure he should ever have left their world of paja y cielo, grass and sky and grass, and then still more grass and still more sky. Even though their world became more and more restricted as progress literally fenced them in towards the end of the 19th century. There's certainly an element of autobiography in his story of an English aristocrat drawn back there in Charlie the Gaucho.
I was wondering whether, after all, Charlie the Gaucho had not chosen wisely when he went back to Chiripá, poncho and potro boots. Then I reflected that the Gauchos say the potro boot is not for everybody. That kind of ambiguous ending there, you know, am I a Gaucho, am I not?
There was no such dilemma when, at the age of 83 and against his doctor's wishes, Cunninghame Graham set off once again for the Argentine, the Pampas, and an appreciative public for his writing. Murray Grigor.
There's a wonderful little description in his diary when he returns to Buenos Aires and where he's actually going to die a few days later. "You're the Gaucho poet," they said, as he came off the boat. He said, no, more Gaucho than poet. And I know Borges really valued him very highly.
Very highly regarded in Argentina particularly. In fact, he died on a triumphant visit to Argentina in 1936, where he was lionized, treated very lavishly and generously as one who had striven to memorialize and to communicate to the rest of the world distinctive Argentinian experiences. So there he was fully recognized, and I think to this day his reputation remains high.
I was already being looked after by some of the Don Roberto aficionados who are in Buenos Aires. And they said, "You must come and see the great Lavery picture." So I said, "Where is it?" And they said, "It's in the President's Palace." I said, "Oh, we won't be allowed in there, will we?" And they said, "Yes, we've asked for special permission." And we were taken in, and it was next door to the President's own office. And we saw him sitting at his desk writing. We weren't actually presented to him, but in this special anteroom hung this huge picture of the equestrian picture of Don Roberto in gaucho clothes on his horse Pampa, which was painted by Lavery and is one of their most prized possessions in Buenos Aires.
The Casa Rosada is a sort of great big pink wedding cake of a building, and in this shuttered room in there was this magnificent portrait of a magnificent man on a magnificent horse.
And physically, that's how he would want to be remembered. But as Scots, he has left us with much more, which I'll explore in the final two programmes. I'll leave you on the island of Inchmahome in the company of Rennie McCohen and Don Roberto.
Cunninghame Graham always took a sense of Scotland with him, and one anecdote tells of when he was in Paraguay and he was on a knoll which had a very good and wide view, and he was sitting on his horse watching. And then another man appeared on horseback beside him, and they began to converse, and the other man spoke in Spanish. But Cunninghame Graham realised he was a Scotsman from the accent, and Cunninghame Graham praised the view. Another man said, "Aye, but it doesn't beat the view from Demayet," which is a very prominent hill at the west end of the Ochils, where in fact I was brought up. And I like that, in the middle of Paraguay somewhere, here are these two expatriate Scots. One's praising the view, another says, "Aye, doesn't he beat the view from Demayet?"